Welcome to part one of the racing game in Gdevelop tutorial where I'm going to be teaching you how to make a racing game in Gdevelop. Basically how to make a racing engine. I'm not going to be showing you how to make like all these crazy features of AI and all this other stuff because I'm not trying to show you how to do like everything like that. I'm showing you the logic behind the engine so you understand enough about it so you can make those things on your own. That's the sole purpose of these tutorials. Now, the first thing we're going to actually do, this is a 3D game first and foremost. So since this is a 3D game, we're going to download an extension, not download it because already pre-built into Gdevelop into its extension list. So we're going to grab this extension. So we're going to go to our extensions tab. If you don't know how to, just go to the top right here, well, top left where it says project manager. Then you go into extensions, create a search for a new extension, and then you go into type first person 3D camera. Now you might be wondering, most racing games they use a third person camera, not a first person. But the thing is, the best way to make a third person camera at the moment in Gdevelop is to make a first person camera that is offset to make it look like a third person. So basically, we're going to have a camera object that's offset from the player so it looks like a third person. That's currently the best way to do third person. Now let's click this extension and install it into the project. And once it's here, we can finally get started. Now, this racing game part one of the tutorial is actually going to be quite simple. All we're going to do is learn the basic movement, the camera, and then some acceleration, and this is actually going to be not that complicated. Now, the first thing we need to do is add three objects. We're going to need ground, we're going to need a player, and we're going to need a camera. So let's start by adding all of these objects. So let's add a new object, and we're going to add a 3D box, and this is going to be called ground. Everything that we're using in this project, every object that we're going to be using in this part one is going to be 3D, so you don't have to worry about creating a sprite. Make sure that it has no lighting effect. If it reacts to light, since we don't have any lighting in our scene, it'll automatically make it like extremely black, and we won't basically be able to tell what sprite it really is. And in this case, we want to show all the faces since this is a 3D object. We're not going to really be able to see the bottom. It's going to be very thin. And the thing you're going to use here, of course, my pistol, if you've seen my other videos, is basically always broken. I haven't found a way to fix it yet. But all you have to do is create a 32 by 32 cube. And what I want you to do on that cube is you can just put some random lines on it to make sure you can tell that um, certain parts are different from each other. Because the whole sprite the same is going to be hard to tell that you're moving. So I'm going to choose a file right here, and I'm going to go to my pictures. I'm going to go to my sprite that I use for tutorials. Like I have test sprite that I use for most of my tutorials. So I'm going to go here and find that real fast. Game sprites. And I'm going to go into my tutorial sprites if I can find it. So right here, I'm going to go and pick this dirt. Now the dirt, of course, is mostly the same, but it has a few slight spots that look different. Now I'm going to go down here in the drop down menu and you should see the sprite that you just placed. If not, you can just keep going to your files manually until you see it. Now that we have this, let's drag it onto the scene. And as you can see, you can tell it's 3D just naturally. Like if you look a little bit to the side, you can already see that it's 3D. So let's stretch it out, and we're going to stretch it out pretty wide because our car is going to be moving very fast. Now let's just stretch it out so we have actually a decent amount of space to ride around in. Now this seems to be big enough. Now the next thing we need to do is add a new object, and this object is also going to be a 3D box, and this 3D box is going to be called camera. This is the actual camera object that's going to be looking at the player, giving it the illusion of us having just a regular camera. It's really not illusion at this point. We're just using another object as the reference for the camera. Now, you can use a 32 by 32 sprite. It can be any color you want. It doesn't have to have any details because you're not going to actually see the camera in game. So it doesn't even matter what sprite you put for this. So I'm going to just choose a different sprite and choose this blue cube right here. So it just looks different in the editor. But the player, of course, is not going to actually see this. So, okay, it gets a blue cube. And I'm just going to go to the drop down menus and put blue cube in all of these spots. And now that this is done, we have the camera. And right now, I'm going to just drag the camera on scene and set the Z order as 100. And not the Z order, I mean to set the Z position because we don't use Z order anymore for 3D. The Z position controls how high the object is in terms of 3D. I know you're not used to that because we're used to Z being like forwards and backwards, but in this case, Z controls the height of the object. So Z is like the Y in terms of 3D in comparison to 2D, if that makes sense. Now, before we add the player object, we need to add a 3D sprite to our game. Not 3D sprite, I mean a 3D model to our game. Because we want our car to actually look like a car, for example. We want our car to actually look like something. Now, of course, I'm not a 3D animator or 3D modelist, so I have no idea how to create my own 3D models. But we can cover for that by going to a website called Sketchfab. And Sketchfab is a website that has many 3D models, some high quality, some may not be high quality, but it just has a lot of free 3D models that you can use for prototyping. Now I'm going to go to Sketchfab, and when we get to Sketchfab, the website, we're going to go here, and it says that Mario dancing down there. I used that for a previous tutorial. And we're going to search the 3D models. Now all you have to do is search car. All you have to do is search car. And when you search car, we're going to scroll down. Of course, you could technically use any of these cars. I'm just going to use a low poly car because Gdevelop, even though it does have support for 3D objects, just know that the higher quality the 3D object is, the more performance, the more it's going to impact the performance. And Gdevelop at the end of the day is a 2D engine still. So we have to be careful with the geometry of our models. So, but I'm going to scroll down until we see this low poly truck car. This will just ensure that our game is not lagging a lot. But you can test out different models to see whether it lags the engine or not. I don't think one model is going to lag the engine. And see, it's a good looking truck. We're not going to be using these animations, of course, but I'm just going to download the 3D model right here. And when you're saving it, it's important to save this as a GLB. .glb is the only file at the moment that is supported for Gdevelop 3D models. So if you save in any of these other ones, it's not going to work. So let's download it right now. Download .glb. And I'm going to save it on my desktop for now so it's easy to find. I'm going to delete it later. And let's just save it here. And it's already done saving. Now that that's done, I'm going to X out this tab, and let's add a new object, and we're going to scroll down until we see 3D model, because now we'll be able to import a model. Name this object player for simplicity, because it makes it easy to remember and easy to reference. And the 3D model here, we're going to put choose a file. Choose a file. And I'm going to go to my desktop, and I'm going to get this low poly truck. Now that that's done, make sure there's no lighting effects, and we're going to keep the width and the height as everything default. No animations. I've covered animations in a tutorial of mine, so if you want to check those out, you can see, check into my channel and see 3D animations if you want to check those out. But we will not be using 3D animation in this tutorial. So let's drag this onto the scene. Let's drag this onto the scene. And as you can see, we can't even see the thing. I just dragged it onto the scene, but you can't even see it. And that's because the Z order of it is the same as the ground, or maybe lower. Now, since you can't see it right now, and you can't select it, what do we want to do? Now, this is when the instances editor comes in. So if you go to the top right of your page, you should see the 3 bars and then like a diamond shape next to it. This is the instances panel, and this is so you can specifically select objects even when you can't see them. So I'm going to click into player, and as you can see, it has this highlight, which means it's on the scene. And we're going to click into the Z, which is to control the height once again, and change it to 100. As you can see, now we can actually see the car. Now we can actually see the car. And another thing we want to do is flip the thing over. Because you can imagine this car being top down. Imagine this in a top down view. That means we want to flip the car over. We don't want it to look sideways like this. We gotta flip it over. So in order for it to do that, let's rotate it. And let's not rotate in that situation. Let's rotate it on the X and see what happens. And that didn't seem like it went too good. Let's rotate it on the Z. Okay, that's not the one. So we need to rotate it on X. And I'm gonna just make it go up. I think it needs to be -90. Yeah, that works. So -90 rotation on the X. So I'm still getting used to all these rotations on the 3D axis because they're not exactly the same as you would think they are. So now that we have all of the objects, this is the first part of our setup. Now let's actually get into some code. Now the first thing we want to do is go into our event editor and add a new event, of course. Now, we want to program the basic player movement. And this is, I know in racing games we're used to the cars moving automatically. In this tutorial we're going to be using arrow keys, but just know that what you're going to see in this tutorial can easily be reprogrammed to be automatic. It's flexible, it's not dependent on arrow keys. You can make it this automatically happen without the arrow keys. I just use arrow keys to make it simpler. Now, let's go, and I'm going to actually right click this event and put move events into groups. This helps organize projects. And I'm going to type in player movement, and let's put this in a drop down menu. Now we're going to add a force dependent on which direction the player is facing. That's what this force is going to be based off of. So I'm going to add a condition, and of course we're going to be using W in this case, so we're going to go to other conditions, keyboard, and put key press, and in this case we're checking if W key is pressed. And then we're going to go into our actions, click into player, and then scroll down until you see at force, at force on an angle. And the at force we want to have, the angle is player.angle. And the reason why we're not having this as a set value, because if it's a set value, it will not be dependent, our moving forward will not be dependent on where our player is rotated. So this basically makes sure that if we turn, or if we rotate our object and then I move forward, it will just always move in the direction which is actually facing. And the speed, I'm going to just put 350 for now. Make sure you set instant, because if you put permanent, it will keep moving in that direction unless you specifically tell it to stop, because it says it right there. So we want in this case for it to be instant only when we're pressing W. Now I'm going to preview, well, I'm not going to preview the scene right now, because if I preview the scene right now, you basically won't be able to see much, but I'll still show you that it works. Now we're going to be looking from a top-down view because we haven't set up our camera yet. But if I press W, you can see it moves forward. So that's good. We can tell it actually works. And let's copy and paste this. I'm going to copy and paste this W key 2 times. Copy and paste this. And instead of putting W here, I'm going to click and put A. And for the last one, I'm going to click and put D. We're not going to use S in this circumstance. You could make it so it goes backwards, but I just don't really, it's not needed for this tutorial. We're just trying to get the fundamentals here. Note this could easily be added by putting player.angle minus 180, and then you can set however high you want the backup speed to be. Now, let's put, in this case, we don't want to add a force. We want to just actually rotate, and we're going to change the angle. We want to change the angle. That's one of the ways we can rotate. And in order for us to go left, which is A, we want to subtract. We want to subtract -2. Not next -2. We want to subtract 2. And in order for us to go right, we want to scroll up until we see angle. We want to add 2 instead of subtracting 2. And even though it doesn't look like it's in a 3D view now, when we set up the camera, it'll look 3D and we'll be able to tell what's actually happening. Now, if I put A, it rotates to the left. If I put D, it rotates to the right. Note this will be changed in a future part of this tutorial, because normally this is not how exactly how cars are. But this is a simple car racing game, like a classic racing game. This can be used for a very classic um, car racing game, because they had similar controls, not exactly, but we can change some more settings to make it more similar to that. Now that we have the basic movement, the next thing we want to do is set up the camera part of this tutorial. We're going to set up the camera. So I'm going to add a new event, and I'm going to also move this into a group. And this group is going to be called camera controls. Camera controls. And this is where our camera comes into play. Now the first thing we want to do is make sure we can make sure our camera is like close enough. Our camera has to have an offset to the player. Now the Z order, I'm going to keep it as is, and I'm going to make sure that they both have the same Y position. So I'm going to change the camera's Y position to 304. 304. Okay, that doesn't work out. I thought that was going to work out, but I'm just going to manually change it. And I'm going to keep it like at about this distance right here. It should be fine at about this distance. Maybe a little bit closer, because it does decent that way when it's close like that. Okay, so this should be fine right now. Now let's get into the camera controls. Now the first thing we want to do, everything in this camera control will not have a condition because the camera is always active, so that means we always want the code to be active. So we put no condition here. Now when we go into add action, the first thing we want to do is click into camera and click hide because we always want the camera to be hidden because you don't play games where you can see the camera most of the time unless they specifically want you to see the camera. Okay, now the next thing we want to do is click into our camera, and I'm going to scroll down until I see put object around another object. Now, why is this important that we put an object around another object? That's because we're putting the camera around the player. So basically, we're kind of attaching it to the player. So it'll always be at a certain like distance from the player. So we're basically, in simple terms, we're attaching it to the player. That's what we're doing. And of course, the center object that's around is the player. And the angle in degrees, we set this as player.angle. This is where the camera is going to be facing. So the camera will be facing in the same direction that the player is facing, which allows us to always see what's ahead of us. So I'm going to put player.angle, and then the distance, I'm going to put negative 150. If you put a positive value, I believe that it'll be more in front of it. It'll be like more in front of the player. But as us putting a negative value, we're making sure that it's kind of behind the player. So we're gonna change this. We're gonna click OK. And also, we also just to make sure, because when you put the camera around another player, we have to also make sure we back it up and make sure the camera's angle is still always set up by itself, just in case something may go wrong. But I'm going to set the camera's angle equal to player.angle as well. You can do some testing on your own to make sure to see whether or not this works. I just kind of double do things sometimes. It may not be the best practice, but I just kind of make sure. Now, another thing we want to do is we don't really have to center the camera on the base layer. I'm going to try to see if it does it without code. Like I said, sometimes I add code for no reason. So we're going to just not add the camera to the base layer, actually. So we'll center it anyway. Now let's go into add action, and let's go into other actions. Now let's go into our first person 3D camera, and you'll see that it has an action here that's called look through object eyes. Now we're looking through the camera's eyes. And of course we only have one layer, so it's going to be the base layer. And we want to do one more thing for this camera. We want to change the Z position of the camera to always be set up. Now, of course, you could manually keep changing our Z position in the scene editor until you get one that's just right, but that could be pretty tedious. So we just have it in the events editor instead since we spend more time there. So I'm going to click camera. I'm going to type Z, and if I scroll down until I see the Z position, I should see the Z. So right here, the Z elevation, I'm going to set it equal to 150 at all times. Well, not 150, 175. And this is a get value. And I'm going to click play. Now you'll see there's a little problem here. Okay, now you can see us move. You can see us move, but you can like, okay, I can only see the trunk of the car. And this is definitely not a good view. Like, if you were showing this to somebody, they wouldn't even know it's a car. They'll just think it's a box. So how do we change this so we can like see that this is actually a car? Now this is very simple. We just change the Y rotation of the camera so it can look down. Now in order for it to look down, we just set the Y rotation to a higher value. That makes the camera aim towards the ground. So I set as a smaller value. I want to slightly look down. And now that I did this, you can see that, okay, I can see the wheels now. I can tell that this is actually a car. If you want to see more of the front of the car, you can move the camera forward, or you could change the distance from where the camera is from the player. Okay, now that that's done, we have basic car movement. Now, the last thing we're going to do before this tutorial ends is add some acceleration. Let's add some acceleration. Now, I'm going to click into player, and I'm going to go into behaviors, not behaviors, variables, and add two variables. Now, the first variable is going to be called accel, which is short for acceleration, of course. And I'm going to set this as a number, and by default, it's going to equal 0. It doesn't matter, it'll be changed later. And I'm going to add another variable, and this is going to be called speed. And the reason why we're adding a speed variable is because we need to be acceleration is going to be slowly changing the value of speed. We cannot change the value of our speed if we don't have a speed variable because that's a hard coded value. That's why it's good to have for any common attribute that your player is gonna have, it's a good practice to always like have it in a variable because then it can actually be edited. Now let's set speed equal to let's set this equal to 350 because that's what the speed we're moving at right now. 350. And of course they're both numbers and let's apply. Now let's go into our untitled events and let's add a new condition. Now I'm going to move this to the top of the scene or the scene editor, the event editor I mean, because Gdevelop, the way it runs code, Gdevelop runs code from top to bottom, which means things that are at the top of your event editor will automatically happen first because it's running it from top to bottom. Now, I'm going to add a condition, and this is going to be other conditions. Click into scene and put at the beginning of the scene. This is us initializing the value of variables at the beginning of the scene. So the moment the scene starts, it will initialize these values. Now, what values do we want to initialize? The first thing we want to do is, let's see this, add an action. And we're going to set like the acceleration of the player to a certain value and set the speed of the player to to be initialized. And I know you may be like, why are we doing that? We could just we could just keep putting in there. We got like hard code the value. We'll set the value by naturally just setting its default state in the variable editor we were just in. And once again, that's annoying. If we want to change it, then we have to go all the way back to our object. That's very annoying. So let's go into change number variable and make sure your player is clicked on because that makes sure this accesses the object variables, not scene variables. So I'm going to click into acceleration. I'm going to set the acceleration equal to 10 because this is the amount is going to be changing speed every frame when our W key is pressed. And the other value that we want to set up is speed. And I'm going to just copy and paste this. And instead of acceleration, I'm going to put change the variable of speed. And speed will be equal to 350, of course. That's what it is right now. Now these are the initial values. I'm going to click add new event below and we need to do two more things, the acceleration and then the stopping. Now I'm going to put add condition, other conditions, key pressed, keyboard, and then key pressed. I'm going to put if W key is pressed. This is only if W key is pressed. If W key is pressed, we want to change the variable of speed and add to that speed acceleration. That's why we have acceleration. Remember, the higher we set this acceleration value, the faster the player will speed up. So I'm going to add an action, player, and I'm going to go into change number variable, change speed, and add. We don't want to put equal to, we want to add. And let's say, how do we access the variable? How do we add by the variable, of course? So I'm going to put add, I'm going to put player because that's the object we're trying to access. And if I want to access this variable, I just simply put player.variable. Player.variable, and then I put the parentheses. And then I put acceleration, a cell in this case. And now we accessed the acceleration. And another thing we want to do, I'm going to copy and paste this. And we're going to put if W key is not pressed because we don't want our acceleration to stay the same. Because if we don't do this, our acceleration, basically when we press W again, it's still going to be going super, super fast because it still has that acceleration that never stopped. So we're going to put if W key is not pressed and we're going to invert the condition. This basically says if W key is not pressed. If W key is not pressed, we're going to change the speed of the player. Instead of add, we're going to put equal to. And then we're going to put 350 because that's what our original value is. Okay, and the last thing we want to do is go down. We want to scroll down into our camera, not our camera controls, into our player movements. And we're going to change the speed of the player because we're moving. So we gotta go to our player movement, not camera controls. And instead of changing it by simply 300 pixels, we want to put player dot variable because we're trying to access the speed variable, and then put speed. And let me review this code for a second. It seems like everything is fine at the moment. Everything should be working fine. So let's preview now. Now you'll find when I press W, I'm moving slow at first. But if I hold it and I keep holding it, And this land is pretty small. I know it's pretty small. I'm gonna make it much bigger so we can actually have some space to drive on without it just going into the abyss because there's no gravity on this thing. Let's stretch it out a little bit. There should be plenty of space for a car to drive. Okay, now let's test this. When I hold forward, you can tell that I'm moving. You can just look at the surroundings and tell that I'm moving. And you can tell that I'm going really fast by the how fast the ground is scrolling. And of course, this is infinite acceleration. You can easily clamp these values up to make sure that the acceleration doesn't go over a certain value. I've covered that in one of my tutorials, but you can just easily use clamp. And when I stop and when I start back up, I'm back to being slow. That's how it should be. And that is the basis for a basic racing game. Like I said, you can easily cap your acceleration and will cap your max speed by setting a clamp value to make sure that it can't get over that speed. But we will be doing this in the next part of the racing game tutorial. In the next part of the racing game tutorial, we will cover things like collision, we will cover max speed, and other values in not other values, other properties in racing games. Make sure you comment down below what features you want to see. This is a constructive series, what I call it, where you as a viewer can input what you want to see added to this racing engine so it can become more of a sophisticated engine. This is not just a tutorial, this is a project that I'm actually working on. So I'll love you all's input so I can share it with the rest of the world as well. Once again, if you enjoy content like this, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell as well as comment. It helps the algorithm. And make sure you subscribe today because I'm trying to hit 1,000 subscribers before the end of the year as well. So I want to thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next tutorial. See ya.